Great. So in the recording, I'm going to look extra smooth. All right. So who are Asian Americans? Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, if you want to group all of us together, are the fastest growing major racial or ethnic group in the United States. But obviously, this is a very diverse group of people that encompasses people who look like this, who look like this, who look like this, and this as well. Asian Americans are not a homogeneous group. In fact, there are significant within group differences between Asian Americans that are obscured often when we are together. In fact, the sort of homogeneity of the creation of Asian American as a term, even though it has activist roots, the roots were to build solidarity among diverse groups of Asian Americans, has also created the challenge and a real racialized problem of the development of this sort of model minority perception, which masks the heterogeneous experiences of Asian Americans. There's this sort of attitude and idea that all Asian Americans are highly educated. They are, highly, they have high SES, they have minimal health problems. But when we actually look at the data, that's not necessarily the case. As you can see, when we look at the median income of Chinese Asian American groups compared to Filipino, there's a major significant and dramatic difference here. When we look at the average household size of Japanese Americans compared to Filipino Americans, there's a sizable significant within group differences. And all of these differences have implications for the experiences of these different vast subgroups. Even though this model minority myth has been perpetuated, which really minimizes the experiences of racism of Asian Americans, we know that racism has had a significant impact on the Asian American experience in the United States. There are significant policies that go all the way to the 1800s, if not earlier, that have excluded Asian Americans from full citizenship, as well as really had a long-term sort of legacy impact on the trajectories of Asian Americans in the United States, with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Asiatic Barred Zone. There was a specific policy goal, a population control, where Asian American women were not allowed into the United States, or they were restricted. And this process of emasculation as well as population control took place. Simultaneously, there is a sort of history of access to citizenship through the argument of whiteness that has been historically rooted within the Asian American experience, obviously leading to many times ineligibility for and denial for citizenship, despite the sort of argumentation of whiteness. And then most recently, and hopefully all of you are familiar with the Executive Order 9066 in 1942 and 1945, which led to the incarceration of Japanese American, many of them US born. Recently, Asian American hate has really been on the news and really perpetuated by the COVID-19, but also President Trump's rhetoric regarding the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. Between March 19th to December 31st, 2021, which is the most latest reports of this data, there have been over 10,000 instances of anti-Asian hate, biases, crimes reported. And 62% of those have been reported by women. So we also need to have an awareness that this racialized violence is also gendered. 20% of Asian Americans have reported experiencing hate, which is a significant group of people. I referred to President Trump, and when we talk about structural violence, when we talk about structural racism, there is no bigger office than the White House, right? The Chinese virus, the Kung flu, these are all words that came from the White House. 30% of Americans have witnessed people blaming Asians for COVID-19. And there's this whole sort of perception of and stigmatizing of Asian Americans as others, as this non-white invaders. I mentioned earlier that for us Asian Americans, we know that hate crimes against Asian Americans, against our community, did not start with COVID-19 and the pandemic. We know that there's long history of hate against our community. And this is just brief highlights, obviously more recent ones, but we are seeing Saudi in the Sikh community and Muslim Americans targeted for death and violence right after 9/11. He was one of the first people to be killed as a result of a hate crime post 9/11, 4 days after. The 2012 Wisconsin Sikh temple shooting that killed 6 people, targeted again because of their religion. And Vincent Chin, if you go back earlier in 1982, again, a target of hate crime. And then most recently, as we are in the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shooting, Asian American women targeted for violence and killed as a result of hate. But I also don't want us to think about, when we think about racism, when we think about discrimination, to only think about homicide and violence. There is other types of violence that occur as well. And we are all familiar with the term microaggression and the daily experiences and the toll that these sort of instances can have on us, on our feeling of belonging, our feeling of being understood, and what sort of impact might that have on our well-being. I wanted to really take it personal and give you a personal example here. So I wanted to share this with you. This is Geeta Gopalan. She was a faculty member here. Is she the same person as Nakia Sherman? Are these 2 people the same people? And are these 3 people the same people? If you are saying no way, well, guess what? All 3 of us have been interchanged and thought that we are the same exact person. In fact, people have had long conversations with us thinking that we are the other person. So I wanted to leave it at that. And as we are setting a context for the conversation that we're having, and I want to take it to the panelists that have been so wonderful to come into this sort of space and share their experiences. I know it's not easy, so I deeply appreciate that. So Jennifer, who do you want to start with?
That's really up to you. You want to move forward with the questions? So
I think if we can have the panelists introduce themselves first, that would be great. So I'm gonna go and look in the order that I'm seeing it on my screen. And Frank, you are the first person I see. And when you're done, if you can call the next panelist and so forth, that would be great.
Okay. Hi. Nice to see everyone. Thank you, Nalini. It's nice to see you. It's been a while. Thanks for taking all of my talking points. My name is Frank Patinella. I'm first generation here, born and raised in Baltimore. My parents are from different countries. My mom is from Thailand. My dad is from Sicily, but he was half Italian and half Turkish. So most of my mix is Southeast Asian and Central Asian. And I will call on, and I work for the ACLU of Maryland, been there for 14 years. Before that, I was a community organizer in West Baltimore for 6 years. And I also worked in the service sector for people with disabilities out of college, way back when. And who else is presenting? Is it Crystal? Do I recognize you?
Yes.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
You're on.
My name is Crystal Hahn. I am a second-year child and adolescent psychiatry fellow here at the University of Maryland. I facilitate the AAPI Affinity group for UMB called Crazy Stress Asians. So if any of y'all want to participate in that and identify as AAPI, you are most definitely welcome. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you all for letting me be here. My name is Kiyong. I am under the School of Nursing at UMB, but I go to the Shady Grove campus, and I am super excited to be on this panel. I've taken a lot of social work classes prior to coming to nursing school, so I'm really excited to share my knowledge about with you all, and I look forward. And I leave the floor to Angeline.
Thank you, Kiyong. Hi, everyone. My name is Angeline, and I am currently a fourth-year psychiatry resident through the University of Maryland Sheppard Pratt Psychiatry program, getting ready to graduate in June. And then I'm going to be going off to Yale to do a forensic psychiatry fellowship afterwards. I also run and co-facilitate the Crazy Stressed Asians Affinity group with Crystal as well. And it's been about 1.5 years, 2 years since we've been doing it, and we've learned a lot from our participants. We're so blessed to have like a very diverse group that shows up, and I myself have learned a lot from other individuals in the group. So looking forward to having a conversation with everyone about some of the things that we've discussed during these during our affinity group. And then I think the last person is Yao, is that right?
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Wang. I'm current PhD student at School of Social Work, and I'm from China and came here for my master degree 7 years ago. And I'm here and happy to share my experience and thoughts as an international student. Great to see you all.
Great, thank you all once again for joining us. I just want to start off with a quick check-in and to see, considering the climate that we are in, considering everything that is going on, how are you doing?
I can go first. I'm blessed and I'm not stressed. Okay, but I will say that it is okay to be blessed and stressed though at the same time. But I'm doing okay. I mean, we hear a lot of things about, Asian American hate and all of these other relevant and related issues. But I think the one thing that kind of gives me the drive to keep going is knowing that me going into this profession, which is a very predominantly white female oriented profession, me being here in this moment and me getting my degree and me becoming a registered nurse, that is what gives me the hope to other Asian Americans that are behind me who are hoping to become nurses as well too. But I'm doing okay.
Thank you, Kiyong. I really appreciate that. Anybody else want to share? Crystal?
Sure. Thank you very much for asking. I feel like a big kind of overarching theme of my experience and advocacy work is the invisibility of AAPI experiences, voices, and struggles. And so I really appreciate you asking that. And I just feel appreciation for being invited to this forum and having the forum exist at all, because as a lot of us have experienced, the racial discourse in America is very often literally black and white, like kind of there's often no room, I think, for Asian individuals to feel like we're part of the conversation. And so I think that I just also share in Kiyong's expression of kind of a lot of gratitude and feeling blessed to be part of this space and see that the Institute is making these tangible changes to kind of center our voices now.
Thank you, Crystal. Yeah, and what you just indicated about the sort of like invisible minority and how it relates to the model minority, I think is really insidious. So looking forward to unpacking that more.
I can relate to that as well. And just in the spaces that I work, in civil rights and in racial justice for the ACLU of Maryland, my job really is to center other voices, and so I feel like my job is to be invisible. but at the same time, I feel like Mr. Park in that I am blessed, and just feel very privileged to be able to just work in the spaces that I do. I'm always constantly stressed out. I have 2 kids and a wife, and my job is very demanding, working during the legislative session. So we're coming to the end of the session, and things will get a bit lighter, but just in this work, I've learned to feel comfortable within the discomfort and stress. It's always there.
Thank you so much, Frank. Angeline, would you like to share?
Yeah, I wanted to share how at the beginning of the pandemic, it was hard because it was scary seeing the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. And, at that time, I was still under the mindset of what my parents had raised me to be like, just keep your head down, get through it, don't bring too much attention to you. But at some point I realized like something has to be done and I have to use my platform and my voice to advocate for change, or else nothing's going to happen. So I really appreciate being a part of this panel and having the opportunity to share my own personal experiences and hopefully educate others as well.
Great, thank you, Angeline. Yao?
Same as Angeline, that at the beginning of the pandemic, kind of, my friend and also I experienced hate crime. So at that time, it's kind of very scary about what's happening to myself. And then I joined the group run by Crystal and Angeline. It's very helpful to see that I have the same people with me and going through the same stressful time, and also the support group from the support from that group. And also now I'm grateful to say that our school start to address this issue not only by Asian people, but with white and black, and kind of everyone work together to address this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yao, for sharing that. And that actually brings me to the question that I have for the panelists. I spoke a little earlier about how hate crimes against Asian Americans are not new. And yet, there is this sort of rising awareness, and there are rising incidents of Asian American hate recently. Can you touch upon what you feel like is different today than maybe it was a couple of years ago? Some of your thoughts about that.
Social media, TikTok, Instagram, our phones, right? Oh, you can't see it, but like our phones, yeah, like they have camera devices on them, and people are starting to film things more often and, create little like infographics on TikTok and like, oh, like there was this individual, here's the story that happened, and they give you A, B, C, and D. I really believe that social media has been kind of like a magnifying glass on a lot of the small issues, or quote unquote small, not small per se, but it's been a magnifying glass on issues that have always been there. So I really like applaud my hands to social media because it's been bringing to attention and helping bring awareness to certain issues such as Asian American hate.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else?
I feel like I was kind of shocked, after just seeing what happened after Trump was elected. He gave the green light for people to just be outwardly and proudly racist, right? And I just working in the spaces that I do, you want to have hope. You want to, I've been thinking about, we've come a long way on race relations, but now I'm rethinking that, like, have we really come that far in our country in terms of race relations? And that's just been on my mind, over the past 5 years or so. And I agree with Kiyong in that, yeah, social media just makes everything visible. That with the green light Trump gave to speak your mind, whatever, say it how it is, right? As if that is actually how it is, right? So it's, I think a lot of people are confused, and I think a lot of Asian Americans are kind of reevaluating their status as Americans, right? I think we all think of ourselves, I do, as Americans born in this country. But you know, when you see so much of this, you're kind of forced to reevaluate and just process everything internally again. And you worry, right? Like, I mean, I live in Baltimore City. I haven't experienced anything directly towards me. But whenever I'm out of Baltimore City, say we like, my family and I we like to go to a cabin in West Virginia. I'm like kind of scared out there. I remember one time we were driving to a cabin and we took a wrong turn, and I ended up in a driveway where there's a big Confederate flag. I was like, shit, we got to get out of here. So, you know, things like that. Like, I think people are just on edge more so than before.
I was also going to add how the rise in advocacy for the Asian community and the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes happened right around pretty much following the BLM movement, and we have to credit that for causing, I think that was the big shift that caused America to kind of reevaluate things and see like what is going on in our country that is racism. What are we doing that we need to focus on trying to address and trying to change and create a more you know, socially just environment and world that we live in. And so we have a lot to thank for the Black community to start doing that, because I think that helped when the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and stuff started happening. It helped to, that momentum continued with us too, so that now we're kind of re-evaluating everything and working together to create solidarity and enact change as well.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, and it really, I resonate with all of the points that Frank and Kiyong have brought up too. I recently learned that the immigrants, Asian immigrants who came after the 1965 Immigration Act, it was very selective. Like, it was selected for kind of like rich and educated Asian immigrants that those resources were garnered in their own respective societies, not using US resources. And that was around the time that the model minority myth started to become perpetuated as a response to Black rising social activism. Like, Asian people have always been used as like this wedge and buffer between white and Black communities. And this model minority myth serves as kind of like this insidious superficial compliment, almost like when you don't examine it, it makes you feel pretty good about yourself. Like, oh, maybe we are hardworking and maybe this is why we're doing okay. But I think it's really important to understand the nuances and the history and the differences between anti-Asian and anti-Black racism, because Asian people are not being killed by the police the way Black people are. They are not being incarcerated the way Black people are, but we are being, you know, hurt in other ways that it's just, you know, you can't ignore anymore. And I feel like we're in this unique position where, you know, you ask what's different now. I feel like we've been coasting for a couple decades using the model minority myth, being like, we'll settle for this, you know, like we'll settle for this white proximity, we'll survive, we'll get by. But then COVID happens, or some big, you know, pandemic happens where all of a sudden the systems that are supposed to be serving us and protecting us fall apart, and we become the scapegoats again. We revert back to the yellow peril by both white and sometimes other minorities of color, because through their desperation, you know, we are the easy targets all over again. So I feel like when Frank mentioned we're having this kind of like collective reckoning of like, are we Americans? Like, are we really being seen as Americans, or is this perpetual foreigner stereotype always been there that's now just exposed by Trump's rhetoric? Like, I feel like that's kind of what's happening, and it's very complex. And I just really agree with Angeline's sentiment of like, we really need to depend on this solidarity, like coalition building. Like, there have always been Asians involved in even like the Black Power movement, but at that point there were so few that it's not only, you know, it's also erased in our curriculum and our history. We are not taught that for a reason. All that to say, I really agree with kind of like moving forward, challenging these narratives and coming together in solidarity.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add anything, Yao?
No, not yet.
Yeah, it's just in terms of, and this is something that you mentioned, Yao, earlier, is, and some of the things that everybody's touching upon is that racism, hate, structural violence against Asian Americans is not new. But then with the advent of social media, the proximity to visual imagery that is jarring, something has changed. But like Frank, as you mentioned, with the rhetoric perpetuated by the Trump administration, it also gave this sort of permissiveness and a sort of larger environment of racial hostility. And Angeline, I really appreciated your point, and I think it's really critical and front and center that BLM has changed everything, not just for Asian Americans. It has changed everything. It changed the way that we talk, actually. I would have never dreamt, even as, you know, early as 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that I would be watching CNN, and in these sort of mainstream spaces, people are using words such as white supremacy. And in fact, you know, previous to 5 years ago, it was even seen as somehow radical to use the word racist. We had to use the word discrimination. Somehow, like, discrimination made it be better. I don't know. So those are critical sort of points. And Crystal, your point about building solidarity, I think, is really, really crucial here. And you touched upon this idea that of the perpetual sort of foreigner, right? That taps into the history of the yellow peril, et cetera. And then as we get into the pandemic, you know, how has this sort of idea of the perpetual foreigner, even as we're seeing better media representations of Asian Americans, played into the dynamic that we're seeing now? Any thoughts?
Can you say that again?
Even as we, so Crystal had mentioned the perpetual foreigner, right? Like the whole, where are you from? No, where are you really from, right? And that perpetual foreigner sort of expectation of Asian Americans. You're never truly American, right? Because you're actually from somewhere else. And this questioning of the American identity, which I think resonated with several of the points that you all made. And I'm imbuing that within the context of the pandemic and what we're seeing now. How does that, how are you grappling with that in this environment? And how do we push forward? I mean, even as we're seeing better representations of Asian Americans, I'm seeing more Asian American leads today than I've ever seen before. And I think that's wonderful. And I think that's part of the sort of awareness and maybe minimization of the perpetual foreigner, yet perpetual foreigner is front and central as well.
So to piggyback off of your statement of like, you know, oh, where are you from? Where are you really from? So a little bit about me. I was born in the States and my parents immigrated from Seoul. So like I have roots in Korea. My parents are immigrants. So when it comes to this kind of sense of like, okay, what is my identity? Because I was born in the States, but I don't look like your typical quote unquote American. And as I kind of progressed throughout my life, to this point, I was like, you know what? There's no sense of trying to please the majority or whatever society says. I make it on my own terms and I am for what I am worth. And, you know, I'm actually in this process of switching my American legal name to my actual Korean name, because I want people to know that when you see my name, a Korean was here. And that's why it's super important for us to really embrace our heritages and really keep our roots. And in the sense of like, am I finding myself in like which identities do I identify in, and its intersectionalities? I just think of it as, I see for what I am worth, and I make my own bubble, if you will.
I really admire Kiyong for taking those steps and kind of like integrating, I guess, all of the parts that make us Asian and Asian American. I mean, it was mentioned before, how much of a not monolith the Asian American community is, like, with Yao being identified as an Asian international student, and even people from like adoptive kind of like backgrounds, or even within, the AAPI community, like the histories of like South Asia versus Southeast Asia versus Central Asia and East Asia are all really different. And what unites us is kind of like racism, like the experience of being an other in America is kind of like the definition that we're using here. But in reality, our experiences are so vast and different. I had a thought that was kind of along the lines of like, what does being an American really mean? Like, I feel like it's advertised as like this melting pot, but I feel like the perpetual foreigner stereotype is still really strong. Like, I feel like the mainstream is still kind of like America looks white, and it's like baseball and apple pie type of like sentiments. And I feel like it's just really, we need to move the needle of like broadening the definition of what does America truly mean to everyone, and like what does inclusivity really look like. And even with the increase in kind of like Asian American representation, there are still ways where it's still kind of segregated. Like, I feel like there's still a sense of segregation there. And actually yesterday I was at an event that Kiyong was also at. We were listening to Kathy Park Hong, a Korean American writer, kind of speak, and she mentioned something about, at least in writing, she feels like it's really important for us, instead of to be highlighting diversity and being like, okay, we need more Asian American voices and Asian American stories, that is still segregated in this is a representation of what it feels to be Asian. It needs to include more of like the integration and relational nature of like, this is what it feels like to be an Asian American and interacting with white society and interacting with other communities of color and interacting with like gender differences, and like putting ourselves also in the context that is our reality, instead of just doing this kind of like tokenism thing of like, and this is an Asian story, like it has to be broader than that, because we all are in a tapestry where there's interconnectedness and like relatedness, and it needs to be integrated truly in a more, specific and dramatic way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that it totally makes sense. And it actually reminded me of this story that I heard about Minari, the film. I'm sure some of you have heard of it, and how it was it was put in the category of a foreign language film, because a lot of the film is in Korean, but really it's a uniquely American story. It's an immigrant story, right? And how that classification again perpetuates that it's a foreign story when it really is an American story. Anybody else?
I was going to add that, and I'm not speaking for every Asian American here on the panel, but I think we're seen as being mild-mannered, right? And we maybe tend to sit back and observe more so, and we're not the people that usually steps out and, whatever makes a statement, calls something out. But I've gotten much more comfortable with that over recent years, and I think that's one of the ways that I am, trying to play an active role in the spaces that I'm in. And I think we have a responsibility to ensure that the institutions that we are a part of are hearing from us, right? I think institutions have a responsibility to actually do authentic engagement and authentic inclusion, and practicing anti-racism has to be comprehensive and intentional, right? It just doesn't happen. But I think, you know, I've certainly been doing that at my organization. And just in recent years, I just feel like I've made that change and just being more comfortable and calling it out and being more bold.
To piggyback off what Frank said, like there is this perceived notion that Asian Americans are very mild-mannered and just we're very like receptive. We're not, excuse me, we're very like kind of calm before we like go on the defensive, if you will. For me, I'm of like the different gradient because, you know, personally for me, I'm very talkative. If I see something, I will say it for what it's worth and you will know. And because of that personality, I've gone some very like questionable stares, like, wait, hold up, like, you know, you see my face, but with the way how I talk is like completely different. So, and it can be so distressing sometimes to other people. And personally for me, I just say, like, yeah, we have to learn how to deal with it. I'm not your typical Asian. And I think because of those experiences that I keep having, I try to keep putting that there because it's like, yes, not everyone that you see is the same. Not every Asian American is quiet and ill-mannered or like very like, you know, soft-spoken, because there are other people who are of that different experience.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to what is a typical Asian anyway. We talked about the significant differences. And if you hang out with my family, you'd be like, oh my God, they're so freaking loud. What is a typical Asian anyway?
But that's influenced by where you are, though. If you find yourself in a room, and in Baltimore, like someone said, right, it's you're in either black, it's mostly black and white, right? A mix, or you can be an all-in-one or on the other. There's not a lot of Asians here that I run into. It's just how it is.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
might make me, as I, that might make me take a back seat, you know, sometimes, and just, you know, listen and feel the room out a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yao, you had mentioned your sort of entry into being part of these sort of racial solidarity groups and your experience as an international student. Would you like to share a little bit more? You shared a little bit.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I don't have the question about my identity. So I'm 100% sure that I'm Chinese and I don't have any confusion on me. But then at the same time, I also experienced the hate crime at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's kind of how to fight for myself at that time, since I'm sure I'm a foreigner. And so my parents told me don't create problem here. So I kind of feel I don't know how to fight for myself at that time as a foreigner, as an international student. And also when we talk about racism, it's kind of it's hard how to say, the concept itself can be new to me, since I didn't experience the racism in China when I spent 25 years. So it's kind of a new concept. But we did have other social issues, but it's not the same as this one. So it's a new issue for me to think about and to find a way to address this issue. Yeah, I hope I'm making sense. But at the same time, I'm also involved in this issue.
Yeah,
It's kind of
it makes sense. Go ahead, sorry, I interrupted.
No, I think, no, I'm done.
Yeah, no, absolutely makes sense. You're coming at it based upon your perspective and who you are. And no, thank you for sharing that. And some of you and everybody comes at activism and solidarity groups and this type of work in different ways. And several of you mentioned how Baltimore is a different sort of context. It's very different than, maybe trying to do solidarity work in California, where there are more Asian Americans. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Maybe we can start with Angeline and the group that you started on campus with Crystal.
Yeah, of course. So Crystal had approached me with an idea for an affinity group that would be it serves as a safe space for Asian identifying individuals we did it both for students at Hopkins and at UMD. And our original intention was for it to address the stigma against mental health in the Asian community, while also allowing us to explore the impacts of things like culture and identity and heritage on mental health and wellness. But over the past year and a half, close to 2 years, we've, especially because of the unique nature of like the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and COVID, we expanded on that and started talking a lot more about like the model minority myth and how that can be harmful. And that's something that we've discussed and touched upon today. And also things like being Asian in the time of COVID as well. And so it's been great because we get a very diverse group of participants from people who were born here, people who were born outside the US and came here at various stages of their life, whether that be like very young during like grade school, high school, to college and graduate students. And through that experience, we've really had a chance to talk about really difficult topics and dive a lot deeper into these things and understand our identity and understand how that intersectionality plays into being here in America. I know for me, myself personally, I recall like when I was in second grade or something, I was like walking down the street at it's like a Vietnamese community in Falls Church called Eden Center. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. And I remember someone was like asking me if I identified as being Asian or American. And I remember responding that I identified as both, but I didn't realize in that moment how much that would stick with me to this day. And especially with the current climate, how much I think about that a lot, because it's interesting to be Asian American and not really feel like you belong in either side, and then also feel like you're not quite accepted in either camp either, because of the perpetual foreigner in being that in America, but then going back to my home country in Vietnam for the first time when I was in college, and also being discriminated there too for being a American and kind of feeling like we abandoned the country, and also growing up with a different set of cultures. So it's an interesting position to be in, to straddle kind of that fence. And so we get to discuss all of these really interesting topics during our groups.
Yeah, and I'm trying to be mindful of time and really think through, and as almost like we started off with the term Asian American, right? And as we're all talking about these different distinctions and different sort of experiences, maybe perhaps before we open it up for questions, if each of the panelists can think through like the utility of the term Asian Americans, like I mentioned earlier, came from an activist community, really, at Berkeley, two Asian Americans who coined the term to develop and build upon Asian American solidarity. Yet simultaneously, we see that there are significant within group sort of differences, not to mention issues that we need to address as a community regarding intersectionality. So what's the utility of the term as you see moving forward in activist spaces? But also, how do you intentionally and carefully ensure that not the most dominant voices are, front and center, and that there is a real sort of thoughtfulness to intersectionality?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that. I think that certainly at the time when the term Asian American came about, it was for political advocacy. There wasn't even like the perpetual foreigner myth was so strong, there literally wasn't even a concept of Asians that can be American. And I mean, as an aside, I remember there was this moment during the Olympics where some reporter was like, this skater or something has to be Chinese or American, like she can't be both. And I was like, well, I guess
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
screwed because I'm Chinese
Yeah.
and I'm born in America.
Yeah, just to give the example, there was a headline that I saw too, where Michelle Kwan, Asian American, there's a picture of her and Tara Lipinski, and it says American wins, and it's like, wait, Michelle Kwan's American.
Wow.
So sorry for
So
that.
no, I mean, it just goes to show that it's still really, you know, prevalent, that perpetual foreigner sentiment. And I've been recently working on an article to try to be published within Child Psychiatry, where we ultimately ended up just having to be more specific with our language. Like we came up with just like a table of being like, we're going to focus on East Asian populations. It's not fair for us to talk about this and ignore 9/11 and its impact on South Asians and like Islamophobia and like stuff like that. We can't speak for them, and it's not right to try. And defining first or second generation, there's a term like parachute kids, which refers to Asian Americans Asian kids who come around like high school, where they get most of their education here, but their families are still back in Asia. Like there are huge limitations to the term Asian American. I think that the next move forward is to both intentionally within our own conceptualizations to deaggregate it, and on systemic levels, deaggregate the data. There's like so little data and research out there on deaggregated sub-ethnicities as well as intersectionality, like trying to find a review of articles of multiracial Asian kids, adoptive Asian kids, mental health, like LGBTQ plus mental health, Asian Americans with different abilities and disabilities, like it's really limited. And I feel like that's really an important direction to go.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was gonna like say that I totally echo what Crystal's saying about how the way we collect data needs to change, because especially like I guess the most common data point that I feel like is most widely used to support the model minority myth is the whole US Census Bureau's like median household income. And Nalini, you touched upon it a little bit during your talk as well. And it's typically used to measure like socioeconomic status among different races, but then it lumps the whole Asian group all together into one homogeneous group when it's far from that. And so on a surface level, if you're just looking at that, you're thinking like, oh, like all these Asians are like so successful and well off. But when you actually break it down and look at it amongst like the different ethnic groups, you notice that like the average poverty rate among groups such as the Nepalese or Burmese or Hmong communities are like far greater than the average US population. And the percentage of them that are living below the poverty rate is, greater than 15%. Whereas when you're looking at maybe Japanese or like the South Asian communities, it's maybe like less than 5 or something like that. And it's important to kind of understand why that might be and what might be contributing to it. Such as a lot of times the communities and ethnic communities that are more successful or might have a higher socioeconomic status It could be because they immigrated a lot longer and they've had more time to be in the US. Could also be that the way in which they immigrated to the US is different too, such as a lot of them were coming to the US as merit-based for like higher education, or because they had something that America deemed as being valuable to have them here. Whereas some of the other ethnic minority groups, such as, Vietnamese or Burmese communities, they came mainly on refugee status because they were escaping political turmoil in their own country.
Absolutely. And that has implications, broader implications for policy as well. If the data is showing, because it hasn't been disaggregated, that Asian Americans are doing well, then why should there be policies or programs, interventions, initiatives, funding that goes to low-income Asian Americans? Or if you look at the case of the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Health has not funded a lot of research that's specific to Asian Americans. That's changing now because of this larger movement of disaggregating data. When you look at substance use rates, for example, when you look at Asian Americans as a total group, the rates of substance use are pretty low. But when you disaggregate and you look at first generation and second generation, with subsequent second generation and more, there's high rates of substance use that are on par, if not above, and are becoming more and more alarming among second generation and above, right? So that has implications that are broader, that are structural. So important points. Kiyong?
I think personally for me, I kind of have to make reminders to myself that when we say Asian American, it's not just East Asian. It's not Japanese, Korean, you're Chinese. It's not like your typical, like what you think of. It's also more, it's more than just that. You have people who are Indian. You have people are, it's more than just your typical East Asians. There's South Asians as well too. So I think from reflecting that, I think it's a matter of just really understanding that there are more than just us.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. Other panelists has been said that Asian is very diverse, and also the culture is different from East Asian to South, and yeah, and in terms of data, it's kind of very interesting that when in my first year PhD program, is to say that kind of East Asian is considered as a to say that the definition of AAPI, I feel it's kind of totally different people, but group in one group. It's it's we don't think that we belong to AAPI or the people in AAPI share the same background.
Thank you. Frank?
I don't know if I'm answering your question because I forgot the question, but this all reminded me of just some work that I've been doing that I'm getting more into through my job. And I work as an education advocate, and I work on a lot of policy related to K-12 or pre-K to 12 education. And if you think about just how our education system is set up, the framework of public education is very much rooted in white supremacy, right? In terms of, what is measured to determine success, right? We're looking at tests, we're looking at test scores, attendance, graduation rates, suspensions, and we know Black and brown children are being suspended at much higher rates for similar infractions as white kids, right? So that whole framework is racist, right? And also we have to think about what are the other metrics that can be used that should be integral really in public education to measure success. And one thing that I've been reading up a lot on and talking to experts in the field has to do with really thinking through other models of delivering teaching and learning, different cultural approaches, pedagogical approaches to teaching and learning. And a lot of these models are more focused on these things that are maybe less tangible than test scores, right, and suspension rates. They're looking at measures of identity, you know, how self-actualized, right, is a student? Are they at a point in their actualization where they feel like they are the best versions of themselves, right? Do they feel comfortable? Okay, they might be getting whatever there's test scores, and whatever is being measured might be okay, but when they get out in the world, do they feel like they can go out and compete, you know, for the mainstream jobs that are out there, right? And one thing really comes to mind. I was working recently, a number of us around the state have formed a new group called Anti-Racism for Maryland Schools, and we're starting to, you know, have more public conversations, and we're going to get much more into advocacy soon. But we had a mental health professional. His name is Bobby Holmes. I encourage you to look him up. He runs a group called Son of a Dream. He works with mostly Black males in the city, high school aged and middle school aged students. And he was talking about a book that he assigned to the group. And one of the students said, "That's for white people." And he said, "What's for white people?" And the kid said, "Reading." So he's like, this is an example of internalized racism, and that this child has internalized the things that he's ingested or taken on from whatever society, from history, right? I mean, this dates way back when Black children were prohibited from reading. And it's kind of how he perceives himself in the world. Like, these things are for white people and not for me. But in thinking about new models of delivering teaching and learning, and including that cultural piece and other metrics for measuring student success and identity and self-actualization, I think there's something there that can really unite a lot of populations around the state, right? And I'm even thinking about poor rural white kids, you know, in Dorchester County, Somerset County, and their outcomes are also not good. So I think I can leave it there.
Yeah, and I think this brings us to, we have a couple minutes before we're open it up for questions, but if you can all briefly touch upon specific steps or specific action items that allies can join in to dismantle Asian American hate, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, I think firstly, it starts at an individual level, and it takes each and every one of us making the effort to educate ourselves, not only on the roots and history of anti-Asian racism, but also on the Asian American identity, or AAPI identity and experience. Understanding how the minority myth came to be and why it's a form of oppression and racism is also important. And recognizing that racism towards the AAPI community isn't new. It spans the history of this country, from the first immigrants who set foot in California during the gold rush to, you know, things like the Japanese internment camps, Vietnam War, and even with the increasing anti-Chinese rhetoric that's coming from US politicians and our prior presidents' remarks about COVID-19 being like the China virus and the Kung flu. And I think that by having this awareness, we can start moving towards having conversations with other people, spreading awareness, coming together, finding ways to dismantle biases and racism in our own communities, but I think it definitely starts at a individual level and making the effort to educate ourselves.
I want to say yes to that, and also institutional level. It has to happen at the same time. I think the people at the top of these institutions, including University of Maryland School of Social Work, need to center this kind of race equity work, right? I mentioned public schools. That's a huge one. If we can start teaching this at an early age, right? Dispelling myths, promoting cultural understanding among the different populations in our schools, and allowing time for people to process that and have healthy conversations in schools. And teachers are not equipped to do that right now in schools. They're taught to teach to the test and make those kids pass the tests. That's how they are evaluated. They're not trying to build bridges and create social harmony. So I think our institutions have a big role. And of course, in private business, right? Private business practice. I mean, really practicing authentic inclusion, right? And I think that just takes a whole, transformation in our framework and how we approach the work. And fortunately, there are signs that this is actually happening. I think we're at the very early stages. But the more all of us can push these big, powerful institutions to operate in a way that is equitable, right? That promotes cultural understanding, inclusion, I think we have a lot of reason to be hopeful. So thank you.
I really like that both of those points, because I totally agree with it. I mean, all of our own journeys, including my own, starts internally. Like, I think that's certainly my experience, just asking myself, like, what do I know about the history of like Asian America, and what do I know about the diversity of experiences, and where are my biases, and where did these narratives come from, and how do I start challenging them? And there are so many resources out there. I really think it's important for people to take that initiative and avoid kind of like the minority task kind of situation where you're just passively expecting other people of certain marginalized groups to educate you. I think that it's really an active, like an active way of being. Like, it's a journey and it's lifelong, and it's not just like, okay, I read this, so now I know what Asian Americans are or anything. And actually, someone recently sent me 5 recommendations that MIT students recently are trying to start an initiative for AAPI students there that is hire culturally sensitive mental health professionals for the AAPI population, create a permanent physical space, the safe, authentic space for AAPI students to find solidarity, build community, kind of explore their experiences, offer curriculum changes that include AAPI history and contributions and experiences, and hire more Asian American faculty, staff, and disaggregate the data that they have right now on all of these experiences. And I also had come by like a series of questions that could be helpful for institutes to ask. How do I increase representation? Like, there's this kind of like acknowledgement, I think, where institutes like, okay, representation is important, but like, how do we get them, like, how do we get them to come here? And I think that it really is requiring structural change that has been mentioned. Like, does the program model a commitment to this that isn't just reactive to certain events, but is truly like showing through advocacy and money and time that this is a priority in the curriculum? Is it being used throughout the entire year, not just one course, 1 hour, to really like challenge racial inequity? Are AAPI students currently, they're feeling safe? Are they feeling valued? Are they feeling seen? And is there faculty development, like Frank mentioned, a lot because of white supremacy and systemic racism? Most institutes probably are ill-equipped to have faculty right now that feels like they are really competent and able to provide this, but that's not the end all be all. Like that can change. And are you putting effort into creating the gaps that you identify?
Yeah, and your point reminded me of acquaintance of mine who, your point about cultural responsiveness and racial identity is lifelong, right? That it's not, you don't just read about it and you're done. I always make the joke, like, you know, I don't like the word culturally competent because it's not like you go from culturally incompetent to like, I'm so competent in culture. Like, what does that mean, right? So the acquaintance of mine shared with me that his therapist, he's Asian American, East Asian American man, said to him during therapy session, he started crying, and his therapist, a white man therapist, said to him, "Oh, I'm so glad you're showing your emotion because I know how hard it is for you as a Asian American man." And he was like, "Actually, I cry all the time." Like, so I think that's a great example of like how we want to go above and beyond the superficial of these sort of stereotypes and what, you know, are some ideas of what cultural manifestations might be. Yao?
Yes, I agree. And also, my experience, I feel like people post the hate crime in the social medium. They don't have a lot of experience or personal contact with Asian people, and this social media kind of create and perpetuate the stereotype. So I'm hoping in the future there are more kind of authentic, the correct information of Asian American.
Yeah, great, thank you. Kiyong, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
While I believe that policy and structural changes are super important, I also feel like that plus going to youth is super important. You know, I remember what it was like when I was growing up from like, you know, elementary to high school and just kind of being taught how to behave in a certain way. But I never really took the time to really process of like, you know, why are we taught to behave in those certain ways? And I think one thing that I really resonated with me from yesterday's event, you know, I asked Kathy Park Hong, like, you know, what are your words of wisdom and encouragement to Asian American youth? One thing I will never forget is be bold, be loud, and also be unapologetic with any concerns that you have. And I feel like it's super important for us to go to Asian American youth and really cultivate and foster leadership skills so that way they are the ones to go and implement the changes that the country needs. So I feel like going back to youth is super important.
Great, yeah, that's a really good sort of point to open it up to the audience for any questions, comments, shared experiences. Thoughts, ideas?
Hi, I have figure out how to phrase my question. Hi, thank you to all the panelists. A lot of what you said resonates with me, although I feel like I'm a little bit at a different place in my journey. I've been doing like Asian American advocacy, multiracial sort of solidarity work for a long time, it feels like. And speaking from the I have a lot of frustration when I'm in solely Asian American spaces now. So I wanna I want to hear from the panelists, like, what do you feel like the role is of things like affinity groups for Asian Americans versus multiracial community building?
Thank you so much for your comment. And we don't have time to get into this, but within the AAPI community, everyone is on a different step of their journey. A lot of people are not as far as some others, and it can be really frustrating. I see that as a survival tactic. I see it as an ongoing extension of just how Asian people have had to think in order to survive in white America. And it's both okay and like feels really not okay. So I really have had challenges too. And I really think that multiracial coalition building is like super, super important. There have been, like, I was talking to a AAPI gay friend who has felt a lot more support from his white LGBTQ community than any Asian space that he's resided in. So I think the whole intersectionality and solidarity with all marginalized groups is really, really important. I think that for us, Angeline and I, starting this AAPI space was just so kind of like pressing because of kind of like the COVID situation. And it's also brand new that's kind of where we started. But you know, after the Atlanta spa shootings, the ACAP, the Child Psychiatry, the Asian caucus and the Black caucus came together for a joint meeting that was so healing, you know, like, because there's something, it's a different feeling when you're kind of filing solidarity within your own kind of like identified group, but when you get that validation and understanding from another group, it really was super impactful, especially with the invisibility. It's kind of like, oh my God, people care about us, like they do. Like it's so new that I just the point is, I really agree. I think that is really important, and that I think spaces for each kind of individual marginalized identity have to be kind of like secure and exist and structurally kind of like sound, and coalitions around that have to be built that are sustainable.
Yeah, I received a question that kind of that piggybacks on some of the things that you asked V, and then you mentioned Crystal regarding the sort of building of solidarity across racial groups, and solidarity specifically with thinking through like ideas and the sort of comfort, right? How in these spaces, these activist spaces even, and how is anti-Blackness or anti-Black racism being tackled? And also, what does that mean in terms of solidarity movements?
I have some thoughts. I don't want to talk too much though. I don't know if any other panelists have thoughts first.
I can go first. I only speak from my experience. And I guess like the short-term solution in my situations and my experience is just to simply have conversations and to get comfortable with talking to Black people. I speak from my experience because you know, I grew up in the proximity of a lot of Black people who have been a lot of good and very like hopeful mentors for me. And you know, coming from a Korean community, it's like two sides of my identity are clashing, but it's like, no, I am who I am, and I want to be a whole surface person in every matter that I go. And you know, I will never forget this time, but I had a birthday party, and I had like a bunch of my Black friends kind of crowding together, and my Korean friends crowding in another space. And it's like, what are we back? Are we back in 1960s now? Like, are we for real doing this? And you know, I kind of was just like trying to see where each people were in their set of mind, but it's like, oh, like just social cues. I thought it was this awkward here and there. And I was like, for real, are you kidding me? It is not that deep. And I was just like, I think you have to kind of get comfortable with, just having these conversations amongst your own community about like Black people are just as like us. We also have that we go through the same issues of the sense of like, we have our struggles of being the other in this society. Let's not divide and let's not be divisive of one another, but let's break bread together. And that's like personally for me, I've always tried to like have like dinners or small little get-togethers just with like two different people in all walks of my life and my social system, so that way they are comfortable with getting to know of like, oh, like this is what it's like. So it may not be like a quick solution, but in my situation of how we tackle anti-Blackness in the Asian community, it's just simply having these conversations and these exposures of Asian people hanging out with Black people, because I feel like a lot of times people get very uncomfortable with that. I don't know why.
Crystal, you said you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I really agree with Kiyong. I think it's really important to not be kind of like self-segregating and just like making assumptions and kind of perpetuating biases that you might have that very well could be easily challenged just by talking to and getting to know more deeply other people of different groups. I think that for me, learning history has been exceptionally healing and integral. And I think that a lot of, my own parents are immigrants from China. When they came here, I think they shared experiences with other like international students where race is like brand new. Like they weren't Asian until they got to America, they were from like Harbin, China. And it's like this, they become racialized, but they don't know that. They don't know the history of this country. They don't know the history of Black America and Black oppression. And through trying to survive, they're forced to fit into the narrative of the model minority, but learning the history of Black oppression and learning, how to challenge your assumptions that a lot of people in Asian communities do have of like, they really internalize the model minority. A lot of people I know are like, yeah, if Black people did value education, they would, blah, blah, blah. But that comes to me from ignorance and not knowing, which in part is because of white supremacy. They don't want you to know the history. And it's also from a survival instinct of, if I am above these people, maybe I will be protected. Like it's this confluence of factors that knowledge can free you. Knowing your own history can free you from that. Knowing the history of other people that you interact with can free you from that. Knowing the history of other people that you can actively engage in can free us from that. And it all just begins with kind of like self-reflection and unlearning the lies that we have been taught.
Yeah, and just because it's ignorance doesn't mean that it's not problematic and extremely harmful. I think being really critical and center there. We have a couple more minutes, so Frank and Yao. Did you want to reflect on the question related to solidarity building and thinking through and anti-Blackness?
I go back to the process that needs to be embedded in institutions. I think that's the way we build solidarity and we build understanding, but it has to be intentional. It has to be a good process. It can't be just anyone running it. We need skilled people, and it just has to be part of the institutional culture.
Thank you. Yeah, you have our final word of the day.
No, but thank you so much for sharing these thoughts.
All right, I think that is all. That's a wrap, but hopefully it's not a wrap in the conversations that we will continue to have at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, and even within your own individual micro moments and your involvement in these sort of solidarity spaces. Obviously, we're living during difficult times of pandemic, of multiple pandemics, and it's a lot. It's a lot, but you know, like my feminist theory professor said, and I will share with you all, don't get defeated, get angry and engage in action. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you all so much. Your time is much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Nalini, and to the rest of our panelists, Crystal, Angeline, Frank, Yao, Kiyong. I just want to make a note, if you all can please make sure that you fill out the evaluations that are in the chat. We really, really appreciate, I mean, everyone is saying in the chat that this was such an excellent and awesome conversation. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and to our attendees for listening and participating with intent. You know, and Nalini alluded to it, this is just the beginning of a much needed and a long overdue conversation. And so I hope that we will keep this momentum going. It is our intent to continue to build on this event and continue to have others. Again, thank you for the nuggets. I learned so much. I hope that our attendees did learn a lot as well. And I also just want to say special thank you to Jennifer and Samantha Fald and Stephanie Foster and the rest of the training subcommittee, as well as to Julia Scott, for really helping to keep this and other events together. So thank you. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you for your time and for your knowledge, wisdom, and expertise. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.